Hello, this is Joy Gilfilen, host of iChange Justice, where members of the Restorative CommUnity Coalition talk civics with people who are living in the aftermath of an arrest. People confronting the compound dilemmas, ripple effects, and consequences on their family, friends, and taxpayers. Listeners' discretion is advised, for this information can be disturbing and can trigger an emotional reaction. This is about lived experiences discussed for taxpayer education and to advance justice system reform. It is not to be used for legal advice. Hello, this is Joy Gilfilen with iChange Justice podcast, and I'm here with Irene Morgan, the founder of the Restorative CommUnity Coalition, to talk about the subject of generations and regeneration, degeneration, and how it feels to be a person who has lived through 80 years of life on this planet Earth and watched so many political, social, economic, civic issues come and go. And to listen to her talk about what her experience has been living in Whatcom County on the same property, building a life with multiple generations of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and how she's looking back on it, having spent decades now looking at the issues of fairness, what's right, what's just, and how does it all work? So welcome to the call, Irene Morgan. Let's have you say hello to the people and tell them how many generations you've been looking at this. We can start there.
Good morning, Joy. Thank you so much for having me again. It's always fascinating to do these interviews and talks, and I've considered myself a country bumpkin out here on my little farm for all these years, but I realize more and more that I have a very unique view because I have lived on my property since 1946. And
Right.
When we came here from Southern California as a family, we moved on our aunt's farm. She'd lived here for 5 years. Her son was in the Army and sent money home from World War II so he could have a place to be when he released. But anyhow, I have a very unique perspective, and I've been really nosy and curious, and I've realized that I'm an observer. I like to watch not only people but events.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been curious and nosy, and I've been told to go home and just be a good wife and not interfere, that everything's going well, when there are many things that don't look well to me. I believe I'm a common sense person, and a lot of what I see in government and our politics especially just don't add up to common sense most of the time for me.
Well, that means that, so let's, without talking about how other people judge you, it's more about how have you learned to think from the time when you were little and you stood up as a protector of the people who were bullied, because I've heard you tell those kinds of stories. But I don't want to even go into the stories as much as to say what's changed over the 80 years that you've been alive. Like, how have you seen and gotten to the point where you speak? One of your mottos is right action for all. Yep. And so you've gone from having those polarized and angry positions and trying to work through your decades of experience and gotten into not politics, but civic affairs and working with nonprofits. And now you're a great grandmother, or maybe you're even a great great grandmother.
Just great.
Just a great. So, one of our colleagues, Debbie, talks about how she has grandlittles. And so you have a lot of grandlittles, but you've also got a lot of family that have gone through a lot of changes in Whatcom County over the years. So talk to us about how you see Whatcom County as a micro to a macro. And then let's talk about what's happened to you over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s to 2000 to 2022, 2025, 2020, we're working into the future. So let's start first with your micro to your macro perspective. And then let's talk about your generational learning curve.
Well, yes, I've said for a long time that I've always been the cheerleader for the underdog, and I broke up fights in school. I had an older brother, 10 years older than me, so I had to be aware, and I was feisty, and I didn't take a lot of guff, and I was aware. I knew when things didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a child watching the people that I knew who were on welfare, classmates and neighbors that were in the welfare system, and they do really well for a while. And then after a while, a year or so, they'd have their legs cut out from under them again. They'd be worse off than they were before. And it just didn't make sense. And I watched it over for decades. I watched it. And so I knew from an early age that there was something wrong. And my parents were always very, and my siblings don't remember this, so I don't know.
Doesn't matter what your siblings or anybody else
just,
remembers. It matters what you remember.
Right. So I know that I have a different mind and it works differently. And but I remember them coaching me on how to look at things, on how to decipher, and how to make judgments about experiences that were going on and current events. And a lot of it just did not make sense. So I've always had that curiosity. And but what I've watched here in the county is what's going on in the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say the rest of the world, because many of the other countries are doing things that and showing how things can be done that we aren't emulating and we aren't practicing, because I believe that's the way our system is designed to work, and that's not the way it's designed to work in other countries. I believe our systems are not set up for success, and I've watched it over and over in the courts. I've watched it in all of the good programs that have been shut down because they're not funded anymore, and there's always some sort of an excuse that doesn't fit. And so I've just continued to put them in my hat and think about them and realize that there's something really wrong. And so that's the impetus that just keeps me going, and knowing that we don't have to do this. It can be different. And the other thing I've realized, and Joy, you have a question that you ask people about the good in people. And
Mm-hmm.
mostly what I see, and I'm not judging people, I'm judging how the system works.
Right.
What I see is that most, given the chance, and COVID really showed this from my perspective, we were shut down, and yet people were helping neighbors and people they didn't even know because they needed help.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so plain to me that we as humans are basically decent people,
Mm-hmm.
decent human beings. Sure, there's the rotten apples that spoil it for everybody. That's where all of our laws come from. If it weren't for the few that make it difficult, we wouldn't have 90% of the laws we have. If we just treated each other as we would like to be treated, we wouldn't have the theft and the corruption that we have.
So respect and dignity are big values of yours.
Absolutely. And that's what I see that's lacking in our justice system, in our incarceration system, in our jail. I watched so many things be cut out, not available anymore. Like in our jail here in town, they used to have a volunteer. I'm assuming he's not there anymore. And you and I have talked to him, Joy. And he said he'd go once or twice a week with his cart of books, and he'd go through the different floors of the jail, and people would be able to choose books. The cart doesn't exist anymore. The cart doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't go upstairs anymore. They have to order books by the name of the author, not the name of the book, by the name of the author.
Wow, how do you get that information easily when you're incarcerated and you can't even?
And so what does that do to the people who are spending time in the jail? And people say, well, they must have done something wrong or they wouldn't be there. Well, not necessarily. And that's something else I've learned, that the probable cause that exists in our system is what on the street is known as stacking of charges. So they stack as many charges as they can, and then you have to prove that you're not guilty of them. And often, because the bail is high, they want you in jail because it's money. It's a money maker for everybody that's in jail. And the longer they can keep you, the longer the funds roll in.
You mean it's a moneymaker for the municipality or the court system or the officials? It's not a moneymaker for the family. The family is getting exploited.
Exactly.
So you've gotten all this wisdom and you know all this stuff, but I want to talk about, how did you get here? What happened way back, over the decades? Let's do a quick look at that. And I'm going to take a quick break because I'm going to give you a chance to think about it. Like, what happened back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that put you on the path to paying attention to what was really going on so that you could see it with those fresh eyes that you talk about. Okay, let's take a break. We'll be right back. Thank you to our sponsors. You can find links to them and a list of our donors on our website at therestorativecommunity.org. You can also donate to support our direct services and our restorative community outreach and initiatives by clicking on the donate button. Irene, let's go ahead and talk about your generational learning curve. So you started, you had a family, you did all your early childhood growing up, but you got to a point back in the 70s or 80s where you started participating in the community in a whole different way. What were some of those first things that you did when you started to recognize that being involved in the community at a different level was really important to you?
Well, as I remember, I don't talk about this very much, but it's very important because I was 23 when my mother died, and I was 26 when my dad died. 2.5 years difference in their departure. And I was devastated because they were my rocks.
Yeah.
They were who I always depended on.
Yeah.
All of a sudden they were both gone. I had 2 little kids. And my husband and I in the early 70s started our cutting and wrapping and then our slaughter business. And we did that for 20 years with our family, grew our family. Our 2 kids worked with us. And I believe that's why they have the work ethic they have today and are valued as employees. And so I had a lot of time not that I had a lot of time, but I spent a lot of time watching what was going on in my community because I had this incredibly, and I didn't realize it until much, much later, that I had this extreme position that most people didn't have because I'd been here for so long. I was raised as a child on this farm, and I watched all the goings on that made me wonder, why are these things happening?
Well, you as a slaughter on the farm type of company, you were truly at the grassroots of life because
Absolutely.
You got to see it and you got to, take it apart, and you got to work with people who were growing life for the purpose of consumption, and you were working in the community and you were a businesswoman. So you ran the business as well as worked in doing cutting and wrapping and doing all of this physical labor and raising a family, and then teaching that family how to work and how to think and how to do things basically on your own with a very strong and hardworking husband and you spent years working in real time
Yep.
with people in this county.
I don't want to diminish Gary's strength. He was just an awesome partner,
Absolutely.
and we did it together. And yes,
Yeah.
I did all the books, and we did, and the kids were, if it hadn't been for our kids, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did.
Well, we also, right at this moment, because I heard the tears in your voice, your husband has passed. So that's another experience that you've gone through. So you've gone from the process of birthing children, growing children, being in business, being a farmer, raising a life, raising a whole new family and grandchildren, and you've gone through the cycles of death. So you span the gamut of a life cycle. And at some point that something happened that put you back into volunteering in the nonprofit field, because I remember that you were telling me at one point about going to the legislature on the, Pete Kremen gave you an award for this self-esteem thing. Talk to me about that.
Well, that was during the time that we owned the business. We were in business from the early 70s to 91. And I just always was curious. So I was looking at things, and I was involved with the self-esteem movement. And so I went to this conference down in San Jose, California, and it was so mind-blowing and heartwarming, because it was like I found my family finally. And that was in the 90s. And so I came home, and John Vasconcellos is the one that was responsible. He was a senator, I think, in California at the time. And he and some of the people that I had met at the conference was telling me about their state of esteem. So I went into Pete and I said, I want to declare Washington a state of esteem. So he helped me do it, along with one of his cohorts that was in the cubicle next door to him. And Bob Basich, I believe, was his name. He's no longer with us. And so we did it, and Washington was declared a state of esteem, and I was there, and I had completely forgotten about it. And I remember it in our 2010 dinner that we had invited Pete, and he was introducing me, and he started talking about this event that I had completely forgotten about.
I remember that.
I completely forgot about it. And I looked at whoever was next to me, and I says, who's he talking about? And then I had to clear out the cobwebs and remember. So he had a completely different opinion of me than I expected him to have.
Sure.
Because he remembered it vividly. And to me, it was just another, I don't know, notch in my belt. It was just something I had accomplished, and I moved on to my next situation. And then, of course, I volunteered for lots of the nonprofits in town. I was board member of Northwest Youth Services for, I don't know, several years.
And when you were a member of the board of Northwest Youth Services, the gentleman who asked you to join was asking you because of your spiritual awareness, right?
Yeah, and I didn't know it. I was volunteering there, and I was doing many other things, and we still had the business open. And so I just, and I also volunteered at what was then the crisis clinic, and did the overnight shift, and met lots of wonderful people there. And again, got to see how nonprofits and groups were operated from the inside, which was a surprise and a disappointment in some instances. And but I ended up from that with Northwest Youth Services being on the CAB board, which is a Community Accountability Board, which I didn't know until a couple of years ago was a restorative justice program.
Wow.
And yet the sheriff and the prosecutor and the county executive all said that restorative justice would not work. And had I known it at the time, I could have effected that. But I didn't find out about it because I was a counselor. I had become a counselor in the meantime. And they liked my work. Northwest Youth Services liked my work. So they were in a pinch and they asked me to cover this particular meeting. And I did. I fell in love with it. My sister joined me. And we did that I did it for probably 5 years.
Wow. So that was your first introduction to restorative justice, really.
Yeah.
And the thing about working with somebody and talking to you, Irene, is that you realize the time does matter. Like things come and new ideas and new innovations come forward. And then they even though they're successful, people forget to pay attention and to continue to nourish and feed them. It's sort of like growing a garden. If you don't take care of it and you don't do maintenance on it and you don't continue to feed it and work with it, eventually the garden gets taken over by weeds. So as you were working on the CAB board, you also ended up also working in the middle with Sean Humphrey House and doing peace initiatives. Talk to me about those things as well.
Well, I've always been a peacemaker, and Irene is the Greek goddess of peace. So they waited till the fourth girl to name me Irene. And my dad had a sister Irene, so it fit. But yeah, and I was the peacemaker. If there was a quarrel in the house, I would do anything to try to stop it. And that's who I've always been. Not knowing that, but so I was involved in the lighting
the peace flame, the peace march,
the World Peace Flame that David Gershon started in I think it was the turn of the century, and I went to Vancouver to see him, and I got my candle, and I spread candles far and wide as far as I could, so that so that we could have a representative for peace on the planet. And then another friend of mine invited me to go to Vancouver because she was the Peace International something, I can't remember, and they presented me with an award. Had no idea that's what was going on, and then I became involved with Sean Humphrey House in 2001. My husband was diagnosed with a heart condition and was disabled, couldn't work anymore. So I, or at least not at the job he had been doing. And so I became the breadwinner and took the job at Sean Humphrey House for 2 years and learned more about the AIDS population and made some incredible friends while I was there, the very short time I was there, and got to understand even clearer how government and funding and all of that worked, and how judgmental and how compartmentalized people can be.
So you also got involved with the nonviolent communications, started working with that in the school district. I mean, your reach and your research into all the different kinds of people who were helping to make the world a better place was pretty broad. Talk to me about that one, because that had to do with going into schools too, right?
Right. Jeff Morgan was, I don't remember the name of the programs now, but Skagit County had one, and it was more successful than Whatcom because Whatcom wasn't funded by the government, and Skagit got a little piece of money to do their nonviolent communication, but it was doing programs in school, and we did the verbiage that the students would, there was specific verbiage and sentences that they would, and that was long before, that was had to be in the 90s. And that was long before the most recent one, which hasn't blossomed like they were expected to. And again, I believe a lot of it comes from I think our television shows, our games that the kids play. I think the it all kind of the peace and the nonviolent communication lost some of its traction because of some of the other influences that came to the kids.
So there was a point where you made a determination that you realized that our systems actually had trouble. And I know that when I first met you, one of the things we went to was an event where we had received one of a small contribution from a nonprofit to launch and work with the reentry university, the work that Jim Kozad did from Opportunity Council, and to help us with working with reentry programs and helping people come back from prison. And I'd never even heard of the term recidivism at that time. So let's take another break and then we'll come right back. And I want you to talk about that transition where you went from being a volunteer at other nonprofits and other organizations and why you suddenly flipped this switch and launched your own foundation. So we're talking with Irene Morgan. We'll be right back and have her talk about how she pivoted from being a observer and a watcher to being an activist, because that's who Irene Morgan has become today, even though she is a grandmother and is still living on her farm out in Whatcom County and still doing the same kind of work, although it has morphed with age and wisdom. So let's take a break. We'll be right back.
At the Restorative CommUnity Coalition, we are seeking donors and legacy contributions for our Restore a Life Center. To learn more about the Restore a Life Center project or donate directly, contact us at info@therestorativecommmunity.org or visit our website at www.therestorativecommmunity.org and click on the donate button.
Welcome back to the call, Irene. Talk to us about what happened. And is there anything that we missed from your early conversations about, working with all these different nonprofits? Because you were observing, as you said, and are there any other nonprofits that you need to talk about that were really instrumental in you realizing that we could run our government, we could run our systems differently, and peace was important to you, taking right action was important to you? But why did you pivot, and what's happened in your learning curve since then?
Well, the information just kept stacking up. Like I said, I put it in my hat and I just kind of sat on it. And the pros were not as big as the cons. And I just, the cons just kept growing, and the pile just got bigger and bigger. And I thought, there's just something wrong. And so I just kept watching and listening. And I was going to the Homeless Coalition meetings, and I remember the homeless being an issue then, and that had to have been just after the turn of the century, the early 2000s, as I started the coalition in 2006.
Sure.
And I remember one of the firemen, I think he was a fireman, came in and he was reporting about how terrible it was that the homeless were so disrespectful, and that they had garbage everywhere, and anything that they had was just trash, and they were just going into camps and taking a tarp and throwing everything in there, and he says everything's just wet. Well, it was wintertime, and so Northwest Washington gets a lot of rain in the wintertime, and he said it was all just junk. And I says, okay, so can you tell me how we were able to ask him questions. And I says, tell me how a homeless person is able to keep things dry when there's a storm, when there's wind. Oh, and he said he had left he said that at the time they had a piece of paper that they would leave in the camp to let people know that they were going to be asked to leave the next day. And I said, so how do you secure that piece of paper? He said, well, we just leave it, blah, blah, blah. I says, what if the wind's blowing? And see, this is a common sense that I believe I have that is not always present. I said, what if the wind's blowing? What happens if that paper, well, that's not our concern. We left it. And I said, well, gee, it seems to me that if you had a stake and a maybe a red sticker or a red piece of paper or laminated something that you could leave on that stick that would stay put in a windstorm, that would look unusual to the people who live there, so that they would know that they were going to be evicted the next day. So they did that for a very short period of time.
Uh-huh.
And that's what I noticed. They may do it, but it's not long term.
Right.
It's not really something that I believe they maybe don't want to be successful, or they don't. Anyhow, I've seen a lack of respect, especially for those who are underserved.
And underprivileged.
I'm sorry?
And underprivileged.
Underprivileged, yeah.
Like they have no privileges. They don't have, because we've done some subsequent research, just a lot of it actually in the last couple of years, about what happens to homeless people. And I don't want to go into this big thing. I just want to share that it's 2024 and we've just gone through several years of homeless camp sweeps and a lot of negative press about the homeless. But I didn't realize until we did some interviews with people who were homeless, that I didn't realize how much technology has changed the lives of people and put them into really depressed and marginalized places when they don't have a cell phone and they don't have a plastic card and they don't have records and they don't have a place to stay dry or to sleep or to be taken, take care of themselves. It really puts them into a civic refugee type of crisis condition that is darned impossible to overcome until you realize it. You don't see it.
Well, and we just had a conversation with someone who is incarcerated, and Joy and I went down to Olympia in 2011 to affect the way people are released. And they at the time they were releasing with their offender badge, the same badge they wear in the prison to identify themselves, but the DOC does not consider it an identification. And yet some people are still in 2024 released with their offender badge. It is not an identification that the banks recognize. And they're released with cash, I believe. They no longer get the $40 check that isn't cashable because they don't have the proper ID, but they're still releasing people with an offender ID. And that is not a system for success.
Right. So people come out, they don't have proper identification. And you know what? When we went down to talk to the senator and talk to them about fixing this problem, we realized that this was a huge reason for recidivism, why people would get out. They wouldn't have proper ID. They wouldn't have a way to conduct business. And one of the things that we did is we made a presentation. I just want to intercede here that it would have cost less than $30,000 to fix the problem at the time. And
a one-time expense. It was so the two technical people could talk to each other to produce a program so that the Department of Licensing and the Department of Corrections could talk to each other, and that new identicard could have been made. It would have solved the problem. That is still not done.
Yes, and that was millions of dollars a year in taxpayers' losses that we calculated at the time. We've got the letters that talk about doing this program, and we're not talking about an educational program. We're talking about a literal technical program. That's all it would have cost, was around $30,000 to create the ability for computers to talk to each other from the different departments.
A one-time
cost. The problem.
A one-time cost that was about the same as one person going through the incarceration system for 1 year.
Yeah.
And it's still not done.
And we figured, I can't remember how many millions a year we spend on sending people back into the system because we failed to allow them to have a way to get out. And it becomes overwhelming when you come out after years. So anyway, that's part of our conversation about what we've learned. But to back up again, you went ahead and you realized there was a gentleman that you talked to at one point. You listened to Don Kirshner talking about his experience of being inside the system, and you ended up launching the Restorative Community, what was then called the Whatcom Reentry Coalition.
Right.
Tell us about that process and how you talked to people at the DOC, people at the Opportunity Council like Jim Kozat and others. How did that happen?
It was when I was attending the homeless coalition that I was able to listen to all these people, and the children were being served as much as they're served. The families were being served. And there was this huge gap and a horrible orifice that they were pouring money into. And that didn't come to me right away, but it was just, it was clear that there was a huge segment of the population that wasn't being served. And that was the folks that were reentering from incarceration.
Right.
And not knowing then how big the situation was, I just jumped in with both feet, and I announced it at the Homeless Coalition that I was starting this nonprofit. And 14 people showed up for our first meeting on a cold, wintry, blustery day. And 4 of them were from DOC.
And that means they came here from Olympia.
2 of them came from Olympia.
Okay.
2 days after Christmas. Horrible. Well, it was blowing northeaster, and we had snow on the ground, and it was cold. And they drove 3 hours up from Olympia and 3 hours back because they wanted to know what was going on. And Charlie was in DOC at the time, and he was Thad Allen's supervisor. And Thad told him that there was a reentry program, and Charlie says, well, if someone's talking about reentry, I want to hear it because nobody's talking about reentry. So he showed up, and we still talk, not often because he's retired now. But it was plain for me to know that I had hit a chord because 4 people from DOC out of the 14 came to that first meeting.
And that was just from you talking at the Homeless Coalition. So
Yep.
So
Yep.
this is part of that ripple effect that we oftentimes talk about, that we don't know when we individually each make a decision or take an action, and it looks like it's not significant, like your state of esteem thing.
Right.
You don't know that it's making any difference, but over time, when you live long enough, like you have,
Yay.
you see the impacts of things that happen, like your meeting of Don Kirshner just only recently came back and showed us that some of the work that you've done with the Restorative CommUnity Coalition and the reentry programs inspired him to go back to Yavapai County and talk to the sheriff there. And that led to a completely different kind of jail being built that's more focused on rehabilitation and more community awareness. And I went down and visited actually, and I'm just going to take a second here. When they created their new jail system, they actually brought the entire community together, and they have a reentry program and a bridge system to help the community. And they've got nonprofits working with them to help people who get arrested in Yavapai County get some services and get treatment, like what your vision of the Restore Life Center was, Irene.
Yeah.
And your
it's not
vision,
quite the same. Most of it is done through anyhow.
It's
It's public, not private, most of it.
Right. But the fact of the matter is,
but
it's changed the way they do business and do jail support services and mental health support services in Arizona. Even though Whatcom County, as hard as we've worked with them, there's many things that we've offered and information that's been brought forward that was stonewalled for the last years since the time you started. But anyway, back to 2006, December, wintertime, you called people together, and a bunch of people from the DOC came. And I know that there's actually, I want to do a jump forward because recently you learned something about the Department of Corrections in Whatcom County and how their release facility isn't functioning at optimal. Now, when we actually have a serious problem with incarceration and with homelessness and with needing help, talk to me about what happened with the DOC when you went into the release facility to give them books, for example.
Well, it's the place on Garden Street. There's two buildings, and they used to be called the Work Release Center, DOC. They're now the reentry something. And people that are coming to, which is exactly what the Work Release Center, they've just renamed it. However, the rules have changed. They're much tighter than they were. And I had some books that I wanted to donate to them. And I was told that no, they didn't have a library, that they didn't want to be responsible for the books, and that they had the residents had the public library that they could get their books from. And I said, you don't have just a small library where people can browse through some books and take it to their bedroom and maybe be able to go to sleep getting their mind. Nope. If they want books, the public library is available. And I was stunned. I was just absolutely stunned. So that it's so clear to me that anything that is helpful or would give people an opportunity to possibly expand their mind or to learn something new is not made available for them. And I see this happening over and over. And
well, the other thing that you reported on was how many beds. Like I remember when I first started working with the RCC, I went to the release center, to the work release facility, and I was working with one of the new release people.
right.
And I started to help him get services and get a job and get to work. And I actually brought him into the office to spend time with us, to teach us, because he had a computer skill that he learned inside the prison system that was not relevant to 21st century social media, but it was relevant to our organization and the way that we did business using our computer system. So he came in and volunteered with us. So I got a little bit of awareness of how important having a work release facility is for people exiting the system, because Jeff had been in the system for, I can't remember, like 14 years or something.
All his life, practically.
Yeah, was since he was a young teenager. He made a mistake and he ended up in the system for over a decade. And I remember going into the facility and there was so many constrictions and restrictions, but the facility was full, and we were working with people that were being released to Alaska, to all over, and from many different prison systems. But now they
so as far as the population, there's two
Yeah.
buildings. They are only occupying one. It
Yeah.
holds 25 people. There's 19 people there. And the reason the second building is not staffed, except by the staff that's there, there's no people living over there because they can't get staff. There's no people trained to be the DOC officer that they need for 3 hours.
So you're saying that we have a completely vacant and fully occupiable building that
Yep.
could help people that are
Yep.
exiting the prison system.
Yep.
That if we were allowed to volunteer or to work or to build a nonprofit to do work to help people do reentry, that our state is allowing them, and the county isn't even talking about it, but there's no conversation about how to actually help these people, and instead they get released with nowhere to live. They get released homeless. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yep.
So that is absolutely absurd from the standpoint of taxpayers who are paying the price. We're paying for employment of people. We're paying for the building of facilities. We're operating an inhumane justice system in Whatcom County right now.
Well, let me interrupt you too, Joy. In January, we found out that one of the most successful teenage facilities was shut down in Southern Washington.
That's correct. That was like a conservation corps type
Yeah.
of facility. So we've
Yeah.
got backwards thinking with regards to our civic literacy. And I just looked at the clock, Irene. We're going to have to wrap the conversation up.
And
But
that,
I want to just, I
and
want
that-
you to close it by saying, what have you learned about the degenerative civic and economic cycles that has got you still on fire emotionally and passionate at 80 plus years old? You're still committed to helping our community take right action to change our state and our conditions so that the new generations are well. What are your closing comments?
Thank you, Joy. I just so appreciate all that you have done for the community with these podcasts. I have learned that we as a society and our government, it is not set up for the success of those who have been incarcerated.
Right.
It's very clear, and otherwise, and I want to go back when I first started. We had lots of college interns. I think this was 2012, and this one woman wanted to do a project, so I put her on researching all the states and what their release programs were. And New Jersey had the most comprehensive, most thorough release package that you could ever want. It had driver's license, it had social security, it had your rap sheet, it had all of your trainings, it had everything, and they actually provided those trainings. And I sent it to Olympia. I sent it far and wide as far as I could, and almost nothing has been done to help our folks here in Washington. So that to me does not show that our system is set up for success of the people coming out. And if anyone, well, there's lots of rhetoric out there that just doesn't fit the mold. And my premise is, if I'm sorry,
it doesn't fit the narrative. Like,
well,
the story doesn't fit reality at all.
Exactly. And my vision is for the Restore Life Center, it's a housing, employment, education, and healing center where when people come in, they would be greeted with a different attitude, not of, I know you're going to do something wrong, so I got to watch you. And not that people aren't going to do something wrong, but many times they don't even know it's wrong because that's not where they've come from. And that's what the life skills is about, or soft skills as they're now called. Just teaching people that have never had the kind of training that many of us have to live life in a peaceful, harmless way, so that and learn the skills that they need. It's my knowing that when people know better, they do better. If you don't know the rules, you can't follow them. And that's, I believe, our charge.
That's superb, Irene. Thank you so much for your decades of contribution to our community, for your wisdom, for your generosity and your caring. And the state of esteem, we can reclaim that in Washington state. We can take right action for all.
Yep.
We can do regenerative behavior. We can build Restore a Life facilities so that people can learn how to do things that help bring life enhancing behavior. And we can work where we have the Peace Arch in Washington state. We can actually emulate it and do it well. And we can build a model that's duplicatable in cities across our nation. And
Absolutely.
It's because of you, Irene. Thank you so much for all the dedication that you've given to this county.
Well, as I usually say, you can't make me stop. I love what I do. and it's important that we all are respected for the talents we have. And for those that haven't been able to do it yet, we just need to be patient and help them and know that we all can do it, and we all deserve it. We all deserve to be respected and honored for who we are.
Thank you very much, Irene. And thank you to all of our listenings for joining us on the iChange Justice podcast. Thank you all for listening. Please share our podcast with your friends and family. Subscribe at Spotify, iTunes, or from your favorite playlists. At therestorativecommunity.org, you're invited to subscribe to our newsletter, connect through social media, or send us feedback on our shows. If you're inclined to help, you can volunteer, donate, learn more, and connect at info@therestorativecommunity.org. Contributing helps us empower those silenced by oppression so they can emerge into their higher potential. Thank you.